Ready to go?
Ready to go? You're on. The mic is on? It's quiet right now, so I can't answer. But yeah, I turned it on.
Yeah, it's on. Okay, good evening. Good evening to the online audience as well, all the way to New Zealand and beyond. So tonight's topic, which hopefully intrigues you as it does me, is a journey to the East. Buddhism, Judaism, and the search for transcendence. You could throw in Hinduism there too, and Confucianism, and Taoism, and all the isms from the Far Eastern disciplines. And why it's so intriguing, at least for many of us, is that statistic that I mentioned. Some say 30% is the low, but some say even 60% of non-Asian Buddhists are Jewish. Are any of them in this room here tonight? If someone online is, send us an email. So we'll do a little unofficial survey. Which is interesting. Jews are 30% of nothing. They are not less than 1% of the world population. So why suddenly when it comes to Buddhism or Far Eastern belief systems or thought, suddenly such a high percentage of Jews? So the obvious answer is because Jews are seekers, and when you search the journey of life, searching for higher purpose and higher meaning, or the search for transcendence, is a quintessential Jewish thing. So clearly, if you don't find it in your own backyard, which means in your own religion and in your own system, you're going to look elsewhere. And in the 60s, there was a resurgence, or I guess a importing of Far Eastern thought, made popular by the Beatles, and I'm sure together with the psychedelic revolution and the other revolutions of that decade, that period, it all opened up the so-called Buddhist approach, Hindu approach to finding deeper peace, nirvana, transcendence. And it's usually the case in any type of society. This is a trend, a common trend. Whenever there's an overindulgence in materialism, and even in material success, there will always be a counterbalance of a voice that will emerge that will rebel against that system. So the way it's conventionally written in the history books, even though maybe a little early to write the history of the 20th century, that post-World War II, which of course World War II and prior to that World War I created a major upheaval in the entire world system, literally a complete upheaval. Besides the literally 100 million deaths, all those even that remained, everybody was wounded and scarred and in some way affected by those world wars. So began, which is also common, post-war, what we call the baby boom. Americans settling in, I'm talking now America at least, into a post-war type of lull or peace or relief, if you wish, from all that upheaval, which tends to drive people back to family life, to try to rebuild things that rebuild our value systems once they've been challenged, once so many young people die fighting an enemy. So America, in its own way, went into that period of time after 1945. But then, 10 years passed approximately, and as it's been documented, the stereotype, or I don't know, the cliche of the man in the gray flannel suit became a phenomenon where American Eisenhower years built the interstate highways, which in turn opened up the suburbia. Suburbs wouldn't exist if there weren't those highways. And the backlash began against this conformity of the man in the gray flannel suit. That was the way it was termed. That people were all almost like a cookie cutter style, and the generation being born, or born before the war, began what is known as the beginning of the counter-revolutionaries, the beat movement it was called then, which would later become the hippies and then the yippies, and all with their variations. I don't want to overgeneralize because everyone felt that they had their unique way, but it was essentially a rebellion against the middle-class standards that America was falling into, which in turn was a rebellion against the upheaval of the war. But if you look through cycles of history, you'll always find these cycles. Upheaval, always followed by a certain type of peaceful renaissance, born in peace. Then a rebellion against the renaissance because it becomes too comfortable, too conformist. So the rebellious spirits will rebel, create a revolution. And hence we have that cycle in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Where we are today is another question. It's harder to define a society while it's happening. But in many ways, it is the conclusion of a cycle that began with World War, and some say it's leading to a new upheaval. Maybe now it's an economic upheaval, hopefully not through any war. But nevertheless, there will always be upheaval because the systems are not intact, and we have to go through the market corrections. And this is common. You go through the centuries, you'll find these stages. Some designate them as 5 stages, some designate them as 7 stages. However you twist it, there's definitely the stages. So a system is in place, there's a certain lull and peace, there will be an upheaval. That upheaval, hopefully like with a minimum of losses, but upheaval is upheaval, will force a certain change. Then there'll be peace with the change, and then there'll be rebellion against that peace because it's too conformist. And this is what happened in the 60s, was a rebellion. And that rebellion also led to a spiritual search. A spiritual search, which is always the battle against conformity, is always going to be with something spiritual and transcendent. In the 60s, it was combined with music, combined with the sexual revolution, and of course combined with drugs. And it was all part of one really sentiment, one critical mass sentiment, which was that the system that we are seeing is not satisfying, not fulfilling. And we need something greater. Now, of course, the extremists experiment in extreme ways to the detriment often of their own lives. And therefore you find, obviously, destruction, anarchy. But even if it's even not the extremists, there's certain things that filter into the mainstream. Some say that the whole computer revolution that we are undergoing right now is a direct result of the rebellion of the 60s, a direct result of the drug years, a direct result even of Far Eastern thought, because new possibilities were opened up. And it ultimately allowed for a new generation to say everything is possible, which is critical for the computer age to have taken hold. People have to take risks to try new things. You know, now it's become common and easy. Everyone says, oh, how could you live without it? But it's not correct. Not everything that is new is always a novelty and always seen actually as a threat. Especially, remember, when businesses are invested in a certain system, they control the flow of money, they're not interested in a new system that may upset their business model. So computers did offer such a threat, and it did change certain industries. Some were able to adapt, like IBM, but some were not, and some disappear. And the same thing is happening now again. There are businesses fighting for their lives, and with a lot of money they can make a lot of trouble because they're not able to handle or deal with the new digital revolution. So bottom line is that this is always about a system and the rebellion against the system, of trying to so-called transcend it or turn it into something greater. And Far Eastern thought, this is a small introduction, which I think is vital to really understand the pulse of something. You want to always get to the root. It wasn't just an accident. But Far Eastern thought became it actually seduced America, as LSD did, because it offered a completely different paradigm of way to look at life that was so contrary to conventional capitalism and conventional, as I said, the man in the gray flannel suit, and conformity of economy, of corporate systems, of establishment, basically. It was anti-establishment, and therefore so appealing to free spirits and also to the young. Remember, the young are always part of this because young people don't necessarily buy into the systems of their parents. And there's something appealing to actually declare your independence by rebelling against the systems that preceded you. So all that combined to an affair, you can say, with Far Eastern thinking. And then, of course, there were the key elements, people like, as I said, the Beatles and Bob Dylan, and then people like Leonard Cohen and others who dabbled, or more than dabbled, and they introduced into modern pop culture, including American culture, some form of, some call it diluted, but whatever you want to call it, some marketing form of Far Eastern thinking. And then when you weigh in with the physicists, once the scientists came into play, scientists, not just like Timothy Leary and the Harvard psychiatrists that went off on acid, but also people like Fridtjof Capra and other American-trained scientists, physicists, who began looking for the parallels between modern physics, quantum mechanics, and Eastern mysticism. So then it also took an intellectual dimension, which is extremely appealing once you look at it from a scientific point of view, because it isn't just a type of teenage rebellion, or can be dismissed as a party and a one-night stand or something like that. It actually has underpinnings that are intellectual and scientific, and profound parallels were found between, especially modern physics, which is quantum mechanics, and Far Eastern thought. For instance, just to give an example, the concept of a paradox. You know, we define a paradox as being contradiction of terms. That's a paradox. And paradoxes disturb us in a way. You know, paradoxes say that two things that seem to be, should be smooth and seamless don't jive with each other. In Far Eastern thought, and this is really true for all mysticism, paradox is actually the natural state of affair of things. It only disturbs a person of structure who needs control or needs predictability to survive. But when you get to the real dimensions of reality, paradox is not a paradox even. There's nothing wrong with saying that two things can have two different directions. For instance, take the human being. Are we consistent people, or are we paradoxes? Wrapped in conundrums, wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a egg roll, I don't know, whatever. That's usually what it lies at the heart of it all. A piece of food, a piece of kishka, or tzont. So when you look at yourself, you know, you may think you're a very consistent person, but why don't you ask someone that knows you, or depends on you, or has a relationship with you? We human beings are walking paradoxes. We're constantly contradicting ourselves, whether we like it or not, whether we're proud of it or not, which means as follows. You can be inspired one moment, and a moment later behave contrary to your own inspiration. Your ideology can tell you one thing, and you act a different way. Your mind and your heart are usually in conflict. How many things are we doing right now in our lives that our minds tell us are wrong, but we still do it? Whether it's out of control, whether it's emotional obsession, whether it's habit, you can analyze it to death. But the bottom line is, we are full of paradoxes. And it's actually natural. You should expect from a human being to have contradictions. Because human beings are a bundle of different emotions. We change by the weather, moods, and so on. Actually, to find someone truly consistent is very rare. And even more importantly, someone truly consistent is very boring. You know? On one hand, we'd all like to be able to find the love of our lives and soulmate that's a very consistent person. But try living with someone that's completely consistent. Everything is like a clock. So on one hand, you can rely on it very well, but on the other hand, there's no electricity. There's nothing unpredictable. And part of a relationship is a certain amount of spontaneity and adventure. And if things become like a clock and a clock, it's reliable. It's good for perhaps getting things done. You're always on time. But there's something wild and people like about a person that's not always on time, even though it may infuriate you as well. There you go, another paradox. You like it and you hate it. Or The ultimate statement in relationships is you can't live with him, you can't live without him. You can't live with her, you can't live without her. Just to be not sexist here and make it very equal. So we're all in the same boat in that sense. Full of unpredictability. And then when there's too much predictability, again, it has its downside. So if you think of it from a human point of view, actually paradox is the most natural state of being. It's true, nature itself, at least on the macroscopic level, is extremely predictable. We can predict exactly when the sun will rise in the next 1,000 years. We can predict the movements of the celestial bodies. We can predict, it's not even prediction, it's just a clockwork that works, how animals will breed, and how they will be born, and how they will die, and how they, will protect their young. And each species has its own particular clockwork at work. So there's much structure around us. But the things that are most natural to the human being are not necessarily structured. So just as an example, one of the key elements, the difference between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, in Western philosophy is very much like driven by certain mathematical, scientific logic. Logic was the prime god of the Greeks. You'd ask a Eastern mystic about logic, and he'll laugh. He says logic is the construct of people who are living in delusion, who think they have control over their lives. And much of Eastern mysticism, getting beyond the variations, there's many variations there as well, even contradictions. People think Buddhism, Hinduism is all one thing. It's not at all. There are many differences between them. But the general Eastern mysticism says logic is the construct of a human mind that is actually limited perception. So when William Blake says, for instance, writes, beyond the doors of perception, this was definitely an Eastern principle, and he actually got it from there. Western philosophy is very structured. It's more like Newtonian physics in the world of physics as opposed to quantum mechanics. And in Eastern thought, things are much more amorphous, not defined. And I'll tell you a story that, a pretty powerful story that happened with me years ago. That's related to all of this. I spent Passover in the north. North sounds good. North of what? North of New York, but north of Montreal, the Laurentian Mountains. Why? What's so special about that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you live there long enough. It's beautiful in New York too. You know, in Kentucky they call it New York fried chicken. Let me put it that way. So it is beautiful up there, and it was Passover, and there, north enough where Passover is still the lake, the St. Agath Lake is frozen, and it could snow middle of Passover, so it has its own charm. We were there with my family, and we had a Seder with the big bay windows watching the snow. It was a very interesting and beautiful Passover, actually. I was sat down at the Passover Seder, being a guest, near another guest who I discovered his name was Julianne. Julianne was a true, we'll call it outdoorsman, but the real thing, he had lived with like 15 years with Saskatchewan or whatever, the northern Eskimos, and really learned nature in a very profound way, and saw his life as a world of nature. You know, he was an excellent athlete. He did everything naturally. Archer, hunter, kayaking, the works. I don't even know the whole list. If it was up to him, I would know, but I wasn't that receptive, as you'll soon see. Anyway, so I'm sitting there, Julianne, who had a French accent, so I saw he was born in France, and a very interesting, fascinating man, Julianne. And we're sitting there, and then I understood after a few minutes why they sat me near him, and we started this discussion. Now, he wasn't interested in the Seder at all, to be very honest. He came, I don't know, I guess for social reasons, or maybe they bought him off and told him that it's a good dinner. Little did he know that dinner wouldn't be served for an hour and a half, but that's why I was there, to keep him busy, to keep him busy. So we had our own little, let's call it unorthodox Seder. As everybody was going through the Haggadah and reading it all, I was sitting near him, and we started this conversation. And it went straight into the issues of mysticism, which he clearly was very, very involved in. and I my own way. Obviously, but we came from two different worlds. I came from the so-called Jewish world, as you can tell, and he came from the Far Eastern. He considered himself a Buddhist, at least philosophically. We started this discussion, and he was asking me a little about the Seder. So I told him the Seder really is a very deep mystical journey, full of, I think I used the word Cohens, because in Zen Buddhism, there's the concept of a Cohen. K-O-A-N. I'll explain. A Cohen in Hebrew is K-O-H-N-E-N, is, as we discussed in these week's chapters, about a Cohen is a priest. A Cohen. So you know what a Cohen is. But there's another Cohen in the world of Zen, and it's called a Zen Cohen. In my more, let's put it this way, amateur years, I would say a Cohen was a riddle. But anyone that's a true Zen Buddhist would be very insulted saying that. A Cohen is a way that mystics, masters, mentors, teach their students how to get beyond logical limitations. It's like an experience of discovering something that's beyond the structures as we know it. The most classical Cohen that has become popular in the Western world is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You may have heard that. This may sound ridiculous to some of you, and that means you're very steeped in Western thinking, but Eastern thinking, this is very normal. It forces you to say, what is the sound of one hand clapping? It forces you to think in terms beyond the normal construct of structure. And koans are, I guess, a method, if you wish, a journey that is used by in that school of thought. And he began sharing with me his experiences there. And he said to me, I'm struggling with two koans that still remain elusive, meaning that he's been going through this journey. And so I asked him what they are, and he told me. And he said, one of them goes like this. Your hand goes underwater, submerged underwater, all the way to the bottom of a lake, and the hand does not get wet. The sleeve gets wet, but the hand does not get wet. That was one. And the second one he shared with me was, a bull goes through a window, shatters the window pane, and the horns go in, but not the head. These were the two koans that he shared with me. Now, I'm glad nobody's giggling here, but many people would giggle. They think it's like ridiculous, childish games. But if you know somewhat mysticism, these are actually profound methods that force you to think in terms. These are. That's why I don't call it a riddle, but it is ultimately a challenge to how we think about things. So as we were speaking, I said to him, listen, I think Passover answers these koans, so to speak. I don't know if the word is answer, helps understand what we're talking about. And I told him that in the Zohar, there's a question that's asked, what is greater, silence or sound? And the question is asked in context, again, of these chapters, where we have two types of service in the temple, in the Holy Temple. There were the Kohanim. The Kohanim were the priests, and there were the Levites. The Levites served with song. They were composers. And they would sing, they would compose beautiful melodies and sing praise to God. So through song, they reached transcendence. And then there were the Kohanim. The Kohanim, the priests, would serve, as the Zohar says, b'chashai, which means in Aramaic, silently. They wouldn't speak to each other, to themselves. They would serve in silence. So the question is asked, which is greater, the melodies and sounds of the Levites or the silence of the Kohanim? So intuitively, most of us would say the sound, because sound is louder than silence. Sound has expression. Can you compare the emotional intensity of hearing a beautiful song to silence? So silence may have its virtues, but it can never arouse a person the way music can. At least that's the way we would initially understand things. You can dance to music. You don't dance to silence. And the Zohar actually answers, in the classic mystical way, that silence is greater than sound. If you learn the sound of silence, so to speak. If you learn the power of silence. Silence, in other words, is not just the absence of sound. Silence is a force of its own. And to just explain it a moment, in a way that we could all understand, is that true, sound, music, and other forces are very powerful and they can have deep impact on all of us. A song can transport you to another time and place. A song can lift you up, can make you cry, can make you dance, can make you laugh. Songs have all kinds of power in our lives, romantic and otherwise. Yet, think of it this way. If you were to express yourself, where is the deepest expression of your intimate feelings? Is it in words, in sounds, or in silence? So again, initially, intuitively, you'd think in words. Especially we're taught, especially if you go to a lot of therapy, communicate, communicate, communicate. Learn to communicate. Break the silence. Don't allow yourself to hold back emotions. Don't repress. Communicate. You don't like something? Have the courage to speak about it. And by speaking, you can diffuse issues, disagreements, and so on. So there's a lot of virtue to that. There are many people, by withholding their feelings, end up creating more bigger problems over the years because it's not like you forget it. You just carry it inside. But let's dissect and analyze this a little further. Is it really true to say that? So there's, with all the virtues, with all the benefits of communication and speaking, there's also limitations. And here's how it goes. Look, practically speaking, when you have to express yourself. I didn't say all this to Julian, or else we'd still be sitting and talking. But this, I'm just giving you some background to what I shared with him. We'll get back to the story. So look at yourself. Excuse me. When you want to communicate, when it comes to talking about superficial things, you can talk about it all day and all night. Well, let's take something superficial. The weather, sports. With all due respect to even the biggest sports fans. You know, fan, by the way, is short for fanatic. But you'll never hear anybody say religious fans and sports fanatics. Just as a small little footnote. So, these are superficial things. Why? Because they have nothing to do with real life. It's not about life and death. You know? And, but we can talk about it endlessly. Open up, we call talk radio. What do they talk about? And if it's not in the season, you talk about trades. And if it's not trades, you talk about the college level. If not the college level, there's the high school level, etc., etc. So you can talk and talk. When it comes to personal matters, and someone asks you to share a deep feeling, an intimate feeling that you have, you're not going to find many words. And not only because you don't trust superficial things, there's nothing to lose, so why not talk about it? When it comes to personal matters we don't trust, even if you were to trust someone, the fact is it's harder to find words when it comes to very deep-seated issues. So why is that the case? The things that are least important to us, we should have the least words. Things that are most important to us, closest to us, describe yourself. You find very few words. Yeah, I'm not talking about what you put on a resume or you train yourself to present yourself to somebody. I'm talking about in a real communication. That's another paradox. And the answer that's given based on the Zohar and based on other mystical writings, and this is Jewish mysticism, which is also actually a contradiction in terms, but we'll discuss that later, is because words are containers. Think of them as containers. As containers, every container has its size and shape. A container is measured, and it can only contain that much. So if words are containers and feelings of intensity are too intense for that particular container, the words will be inadequate. That's what's called, I don't have the words. I have no words to express myself. You ever hear that expression? Or you use it. I don't mean as a euphemism, as a statement, but I don't have words to express my love. I have no words to express my appreciation. Because words are containers. So what do, humans? We create what's called the language of metaphor. Metaphor is analogies, poetry, words that are somewhat abstract. You know, children hate poetry because they don't relate to its intangible nature. Many adults do too, but it's not cool to say so. But poetry is like, why don't you just say what you want to say? Why do you have to be so cryptic and so mysterious? But the fact is, metaphor creates broadens the containers because precisely it's not so limited in its container. So metaphor allows for more expression to come through. But then there's also limitations to that container. So you travel deeper, the more intense basically the feeling, the less container is possible to contain it. So then there's something that can be expressed only with a cry, or with a laugh, or with oy vey, And then there's an intensity that even oivei and even a laugh or a cry cannot express it. That's why you find, tragically, in a situation where there's real trauma, post-traumatic, immediate post-trauma, will always be what we call shock. So much shock you can't even cry. Why is a person not crying? They're right near the trauma. They should be crying more than they cry the next day. And you'll see real traumatic experiences, and God forbid everyone should be protected from them. You can't even cry for a few days. Crying is like the first stage of expression, because it's so intense that even the cry, basic cry, which doesn't have any intelligence in it, is also too small of a container. So if you really think about it, the deeper you go inside of yourself, by definition, the more intimate, the more intense, the more, using Kabbalistic language, the more light, the more energy, the less container. The more container, the less energy. That's how it works. So in that context, basically going back now to the Zohar, that's why the power of silence of the priests, of the Kohanim, is more powerful than the melody of the Levites. The fascinating thing is, which we shall discuss, is that Judaism's objective ultimately is not to remain in silence. It's to what we call express the inexpressible. Imagine you were able to express in words that which words itself cannot contain. That's the ultimate goal, the bridging of the transcendent into the tangible reality of our lives. That's the ultimate goal in Jewish mysticism, which we shall soon talk about. Not so in Far Eastern. So let's go back to the story of the Cohens with Julian. So I shared with Julian just briefly this thing about silence and sound. And I said, according to the Zohar, which is the classical book of Jewish mysticism, silence is deeper and more powerful than sound. Even though in the world of sound, we would never say that. Because in the world of sound, look around. Why do so many people have to feel that they have to express themselves at a table or at a party? Because they have to sound intelligent. If you sit quietly, you sometimes look passive, not aggressive, not a go-getter. So many people talk just to talk. But there's expression in the Pirkei Avot, siyag l'chachma shtika. Wise people are the most silent of all. You really see the wisdom the real wisdom of a wise person. You see in silence much more than in words. They know when not to say as well. They know when to say. So the fact that a person is silent don't always be deceived to think that it shows the person doesn't have anything to say. A wise person doesn't say things in certain situations. You can learn more from a wise person when they don't say than from what they do say. So in that vein, if you think about it that way, as I said to Julian, so silence is, I said, I think I can explain to you the Cohens that you pointed out. You know, you talk about the hand going into the water and not getting wet. So let me ask you a question. And as we were speaking, the rest of the table were busy. I don't know where they were at this point of the Haggadah, because we were so engrossed. Meanwhile, also, I was making sure that Julian was drinking enough wine, and I also had to drink in order to make sure. So it was also helpful to the whole conversation. Even though 4 cups of wine, they say after 2 cups, you're allowed to drink the other cups in the middle of the meal. We cheated a bit, I think, but if I may admit to the rabbis in the audience and on camera. Okay, trust me, I've done worse in my life. So the wine was helping out, and Julian was getting more and more engaged in this conversation. He was really interested about the silence and the sound. And I said to him, let me ask you this question. And I didn't try to present it as a Cohen, but clearly he took it that way. And I said to him, let me ask you, can fish get wet? And what about water? Can water get wet? And of course the answer is water can get wet because water is wet. Wetness doesn't get wet. Only dry things get wet. In other words, that whole concept of something getting wet means there's a state of being that gets wet. But if you are that state of being, you don't get wet. So I said to him, the reason that silence can be more powerful than sound is because ultimately there's a world, a reality, that's neither silence nor sound. And therefore it's not limited to words, and it's not limited to silence. I said the same is true in Jewish thought, I told him. And we were talking in brief terms. I wasn't so elaborate because it wasn't that the need to be philosophical with him. He was getting it instinctively because as I said, he was a mystical person. I said to him, I'm just elaborating more to make sure it makes sense. Shouldn't sound completely under the influence of the wine. So I said to him, there's a concept of water being a metaphor for knowledge. We say mei hadas hatoher, the pure waters of knowledge. Or the ultimate expression is in Isaiah, the prophet, that we read in the Haftarah on the last day of Passover, where he describes the future, and he says it in the most beautiful and, you can say, prescient way. Hard to imagine even that how would he know this? He says, the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. So you may have heard the expression, but think about it. Besides the poetry of it, it's extremely powerful to make that statement. In other words, he compares knowledge to water. And there's water in a cup, and there's water as it covers the sea. Waters that cover the sea are so dominant that you don't even see the seabed. In other words, the knowledge is more powerful than the containers. And that's what Isaiah was saying, that the world will be filled with so much divine knowledge, like the waters cover the sea. Knowledge will not just be, oh, I know something. We will be knowledge. So just like water doesn't get wet, and only something dry gets wet, the same thing is with intelligence and knowledge. Someone that doesn't have much knowledge becomes a knower. But someone who is knowledge doesn't have to know. They are knowledge. You become one with it. And when you become one with it, you don't get wet. And knowledge is water. And then I said to him, regarding the second Cohen, there's the story with the professor, philosophy. At the end of the course, this very high-level philosophical course, he asked the students to write a dissertation, to write a paper, the following question. It's a one-word question. Why? He wrote it on the board. Why? He says, please write a paper. Tell me why. Students asked him how long the paper. He says, any length you like. Give me an answer. So, of course, the most profound of the students wrote the longest papers, came back with 100, 200-page dissertations. Why? And the two best marks were these two students. One who answered why, his answer was because. And the second one who got the A+ was the one why, his answer was why not. This is philosophy 101. So I said to him, ask me why the bull goes in with the horns and the head doesn't go in through the glass. Why not? Especially when you go to a world where the dry and the wet is one, and sound and silence are one. Where you're one with the reality, you don't ask a question why something happens, why not? Because only in the linear world is there that type of distinction. Something exists and it gets wet. Something is ignorant and it gets knowledgeable. But not one becomes one with the experience itself. Then you don't have an object and a subject. This is exactly what happened. Julian jumped up from the table, from the seat actually. Didn't jump up on the table, but he jumped up from the seat. And he says, that's brilliant. I'm not saying this to toot my horn, I'm just telling you what happened. He was running around. The people at the table, and I should add, some of them were Orthodox Jews. As you can see, I don't consider myself one of those. But they didn't know what's going on. They thought we were both a little crazy. But that's where they sat me down near him in the first place, I guess. And we were whispering this whole Seder. We were talking to each other through this whole Seder. So who knows what we were talking about? Maybe we were talking about sports or other interesting archery or kayaking in the Arctic Sea or something like that. So he jumped in. He was running around the table like a lunatic, practically. He's a real natural guy, so he doesn't have any inhibitions of what people think. And it's brilliant. And he's saying, why not? Of course, why not? Why not? And this was going on maybe for 5-10 minutes. Meanwhile, everyone was taking a break regardless, and this one, there's a Seder going on, why not? And he was running around with why not. Everyone said, what's this why not thing? So I said, it's a long story, I can't really get into it right now. I remember what I answered one person. I said, he's celebrating possibilities. So why not? That's what you say when you celebrate possibilities. Good. Anyway, this is the story. It's far from over. We have a long night. He finally sits down. At this point, I gave in to my big temptation of eating the egg. That egg at the end of the whole tradition. So for some reason, maybe as a child, it's like you're waiting so long for the meal, so the egg represents the beginning of the meal. So I used to gobble down these hard-boiled eggs. And my mother would always say, who ate up half these eggs? Where'd they all go? I said, I don't know. But that was one of my little cheating moments. And we finally settled back into the to the Seder. Well, the meal was now at this point, and Julian was good and drunk, and he was just carrying on with his why not. The truth is, I'm not trying to be cynical, and I wasn't. I was serious. I didn't take it as seriously as he did. Let's put it this way, because it was clearly that these Cohens he was struggling with, and for him this wasn't just like an insight. It was like an experience, which I came to learn later, as you'll see. Anyway, sometime the rest of the evening, no more words between me and Julian. No more sound, it was all silence, which, as you know, is deeper than sound, as we just learned. So we just sat there, and I don't mean like glumps, like idiots. We did what we did. There was the meal, there were other people to deal with as well. And at the end of the evening, which was quite a few hours later, the meal was finished. We ate afikomen, we had 4 cups. Half the people were asleep already. So Julian looks at me, and you could see this was after he was in profound thought, I should add, during this whole period in time that we were quiet. He was just thinking. I saw he was in his own space. Very interesting guy, really unbelievable, like a colorful figure. He has this like, what do they say, etched face, like etched in the sun and etched in the cold. And he looks at me, and I remember this, I'll never forget. He looks at me with these laser beam eyes and says to me, okay, as if we were just continuing a conversation. We hadn't spoken for 2 hours, mind you. He says to me, so tell me. And this was like dead serious. So, okay, you gave me all these, the why not and the Cohens. I want to ask you, so why did God allow the Holocaust? Like, I'm glad you were, I wish you were there. Yeah. So he said to me, why did God allow the Holocaust? And it came from such a deep place. Now, if you just think of it all linearly, you could say, how did that come out? Where did that come from? We were talking this, waxing eloquent about Cohens and about water and dry and sound and silence and being and non-being. Where did this come from? But I understood, because for him it wasn't, as I said, some intellectual exercise. It was looking at life. What is life? And this was clearly deeply bothering him. So I said to him, look, Julian, you seem to have, you clearly have paid many prices and gone on your journey through the Cohens and through Buddhism and through the other things you've gone through that have helped understand or relate to some of the paradoxes of life. But maybe this Cohen is the greatest and hardest one of all that you and I will never have an answer for. Can you live with that? Because this is something that there is no answer for. This, I'm not going to tell you an answer. The hand doesn't get wet because water doesn't get wet. Or fish don't get wet because they are wetness. This is the ultimate paradox. And this one maybe we'll never conquer with a conversation, one or two. And this, the ultimate silencing and the ultimate humility, because we cannot fathom something that is so inexplicable. Do you have the courage to face this Cohen? The rest of the Cohens are, I don't call them entertainment, but they're nice mind games, and even if they are profound and they can affect your life, but they don't force you into a place that's completely uncomfortable. This is emotionally uncomfortable, intellectually impossible, and in every possible way leaves us perplexed. Can we live with that and forge ahead? Not just with bitterness. It's more or less what I said to him. And he looked at me, he was listening, and as I said, he was a truly intelligent person. Firstly, he didn't just ask questions, he listened to an answer as well. With the same intensity he asked, he also listened. I hope I reciprocated. And he didn't say anything, he looked at me, didn't say a word. Then we got up to say goodnight, and he left, he was by the door, and he looked at me and he said to me, yes, but it's so difficult. And this was like with the anguish. There was no question he was a Holocaust survivor or the child of one or something like that, which I would find out later as well. He left, and the next day he comes back to the lunch, and he has to see me, so I came out, and he says, let's go for a walk. So we go for a walk, and no real conversation going on. He says, You ever walk, like walk, like, and not walk to shul, walk to walk properly? So I said, not really. So I said, let me teach you how to walk. And we started these exercises. It was the second day of Yom Tov, of Passover. And I don't know if I was dressed for walking exactly, but we started walking, and he started giving me this whole thing about walking with 5 breaths in and 5 breaths out in every pace you take. He says, you won't be able to do that so fast. So try 2 breaths in and 2 breaths out for every pace. It's not so simple, as you discover. And I tried it, and then he went like 100 yards ahead. He says, walk to me and do those. It was the whole procedure. For an hour, he was giving me these lessons in walking. And he says, so if you do this right, the first 3 weeks you walk with 2 breaths per pace, 200 paces every morning and in the evening. And then after 3 weeks, you start 3 breaths per pace. And you walk for another 45 minutes. Like the whole regimen. And then he gave me the whole thing, how to dress, the loose clothing, and then make sure afterwards to shower, to get rid of the salt in the pores. It was very fascinating. This guy knew the human body inside out, knew every reaction, and how to make your body breathe again. That's what he said. You need to make it breathe. And he talked about it with such passion. I was just... I was seduced simply by his excitement about it. It's like, someone describing to you how to eat chocolate cake, but like with the oozing chocolate, that type of thing, makes you hungry as we speak. Well, he was making me hungry, but I don't know if I was ready for the discipline, but I liked the idea. I said to him, maybe I'll write an article about it. He says, no escaping into writing. You got to do this in the real world. So anyway, he asked me to promise him come back and get walking when I get back to New York, to get walking shoes and do this and that. So I don't know. I couldn't utter a promise. I have this thing. We Jews have a thing called blined, which means I promise, but I don't promise. I promise, but without a true vow. It's basically a loophole, an exit strategy when things get desperate. So just in case, like that's why I affirm. I don't vow. Okay. So, but I said enough to satisfy him. And I didn't even wonder really what was going on here. Last night we had this fascinating discussion about Cohens and all that. It was much easier for me actually than this walking. And here he's carrying on with this walking and no reference made at all to last night. And then I realized when we went back home, I thought to myself, and I was very moved actually, that I introduced him to my God and he was introducing me to his God. His God was the God of nature, the God of walking, the God of the body. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way. That was the God that he came to worship. And he was doing me, actually, it was a sign of affection that I introduced him to something and he was introducing me to something. And I didn't need to actually affirm it. I didn't need to ask him. It was a relationship beyond that. We made this connection, which was unbelievable connection. It's not like we spoke again. I only met him recently, maybe 15 years later at a wedding in Montreal. And he remembered me. He's much older now. And we didn't even have to go back there, but, he gave me the look. I knew that we both remembered. And let me tell you what happened next, if I may. This is my so-called Buddhist experience. I wrote up an article in a magazine about the story. I called it The Silent Cohen. And I meant both a double entendre, which means Cohen as in Cohen the priest, that served in silence in the temple, as the Torah talks about in these chapters, and Cohen as in Koan, the Cohen of the Zen. And I told the story. Now here's the end of the story with Julian, which I only found out later from the host that invited us all to the Seder. The story with Julian is that Julian's last name, family name, is Hassid. We call it Chassid. That's what his name is, Julian Chassid. And he's a French-born Jew that did go through the Holocaust. His parents, actually, more than him. But more importantly, Julian's grandfather was a Belzer Chassid. A real Chassid, a Belzer Chassid. And he lived in a city called Belz. Belz is a town in Eastern Europe, known as the Belzer Chassidim until this day, the Belzer Chassidim, Belzer Rebbe in Jerusalem. It's one of the largest Hasidic groups, the largest shul in Jerusalem, one of the largest mikvahs there. And his grandfather was a Belzer Chassid. he was so devout and also so radical that one day he found his son, meaning Julian's father, reading an inappropriate book, or that he thought was inappropriate. I don't know what it was about. And he got so angry, he threw him out of the house. And it was a cold winter morning, and his son thrown out of the house had no coat, and he ended up wandering around the snow till he fell, fainted, and almost died until someone found him. They carried him back, literally frostbitten or close to death, to his home. And when he was revived, he took a pair of scissors, and he cut off his payas. Some Chassidim wear long payas, the airlocks, in front of his father, and told him whatever language, I don't know, to go to hell basically, and he left never to come back home again. He moved to Paris, and he married a Jewish woman, but not necessarily probably like himself, not observant. And Julian is a child of those parents. And Julian grew up in a home of this son. So you can imagine what kind of attitude he had to Judaism in general, and particularly called Hasidic Judaism. That's Julian. This is what I was told the story. So obviously I didn't judge him, not at the Seder, and I didn't judge him afterwards, because you never know a person's background. But then I came to discover, and that's when I wrote the article, because I could not believe the coincidence, or if you call it, whatever you call it, Julian Chassid is a Cohen himself, a real Cohen, not a Cohen, K-O-A-N. He's a family of priests. So I told him the story about the Cohen. I didn't know if he knows. I till this day I don't even know if he knows he's a Cohen. So I wrote up the story, and it was published in this magazine. It doesn't end here. And one day I get a letter, a 30-page letter. Like if you ever see, Rashi, the commentary on Chumash. So Rashi is like a gloss all over. Like here's let's say the chapter, and Rashi has commentary, and there are other commentaries. So my article was quoted. Every line of the article is like cited, and then like maybe 2 paragraphs of refutation. And but no one else but who's the one that wrote this 30-page so-called refutation of my article. I mean, I can't say refutation, everything, but a lot of it, critical and this. The famous singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen. Another Cohen, who is known, some people call him a Buddhist Jew. He actually lived for over 20 years on a Zen Buddhist monastery in California. And he wrote me this long critique in a very gentle and poetic way, the way he can write, on this article. It's completely out of the blue. So I responded to him in a letter, to which he responded again, and we started a communication. To the extent he invited me to come visit him. So next time I was in California, I went to visit Leonard Cohen at the Zen Buddhist. It's called Mount Baldy, Inland Empire. It's like an hour in from the coast of L.A. And I came there. A rabbi took me who knew how to get there. And we come there. And they were in the middle, the Buddhist monastery, or as it's called a retreat, where they were in the middle of this a ritual that they do every once a year. I'm not sure what it's called, but like for 7 days, it's a whole rituals of fasting and praying and meditating. And they were all in their garb, white garb, and Leonard Cohen was there as well. And when we stood on the side respectfully, when he saw us, he walked out of the line and took us to his cabin, so to speak, which was all hooked up to music, like a music engineering studio, basically. But it was very simple. It was rustic. Took out some Turkish cigarettes. Nothing illegal. And offered it to us. Actually, it was very good tasting. And we started. We said L'chaim. And I sang him a song. I remember Shamil. And then he asked for another Hasidic melody. And we were sitting into the night, what we call a Hasidic Farbrengen. Very fascinating evening. And I really hit it off with him. Then next time I came to LA, I came to his house. It's a whole story. I don't want to go through the whole details. I maintain a good relationship with him. As a matter of fact, when he was just played now in the Beekman Theater in New York, when was it, a few weeks ago, like a month ago? So I got a call next day from the New York Times who were doing a story on him. And they asked the question to him, how could you be both Buddhist and Jewish? Isn't a contradiction. Judaism is a deity. Buddhism doesn't accept deities. Anyway, he gave his answer that Buddhism is not, there's no deities. It's not a question of idol worship. They don't believe in deities. So it's not a contradiction. It's a way of thinking. Anyway, and he said to them, why don't you call Rabbi Jacobson, who I'm good friends with, and he'll give you more explanation. So they called me. And he told them that we had a correspondence. They asked me to see the correspondence. They didn't end up doing an article on it because they saw it deserved its own story, so maybe one day. But the bottom line is, all this I'm sharing with you is, even though it's in story form, but the real point here is, of course, this whole idea of mysticism, the Eastern and the Western thought. And what it comes down to is this. In the discussion that I had with Leonard in the communication, above all, the big question, and this is probably where there's a major difference between Jewish mysticism and the Eastern, even though there are many similarities that we shall discuss, is the issue of integrating a transcendental experience into your life. In Judaism, we find the concept of a mitzvah, an act, and not one mitzvah, 613 mitzvahs, mind you. That there is no area in the material life that we don't have a mitzvah that addresses it. How to eat, how to sleep, how to marry, divorce, death, birth. There's no area in our material life that doesn't have a mitzvah connected to it. Even how to tie your shoelaces, what shoe to put on first, how do you cut your nails. So not everything goes into the category of one of the 613 biblical edicts, but everything is regulated. There's a Shulchan Aruch that really addresses every detail of life. Which really, and for many, especially mystical people, spiritual people, seems counter and antithetical to the mystical experience. Because when you talk about free-spiritedness, it's always not about rigidity, do this and don't do that. It's about going into an ethereal space that's not defined by mechanics. So the mechanics of Judaism can be seen as a true contradiction to spirituality. To the point, I can tell you, that there are people, very devout Jews, who, when I began giving this class, I remember once going to a shul synagogue, one of them says, what's this spirituality, this alien spirituality you're introducing into Judaism? He heard from someone who came to my class that I talked about spirituality. And to him it was like a contradiction to Judaism. Though he was a scholar and devout, but he saw the spirit as being some type of, he says, this is, you're bringing Buddhism into Judaism. And I just smiled. I answered with silence. Let's put it that way. But what the real answer is very simple. He's simply ignorant of what we call, maybe the spiritual word is off-putting to some people, but the word is called ruchnius. Ruchnius is a word in Hebrew. It's not a Buddhist word. Ruchnius means spirituality. Neshama is a soul. These are words that are coming from the Torah itself. And they come from the basic principles of Jewish faith. It's not some New Age concept. Unfortunately, there's a divorce for many people between what we call the mechanics and robotics of Judaism and its soul. Now, when you go into the Far Eastern disciplines, you find there is not the same obsession, for sure not, but even necessity to go into the rituals. One of the distinctions between Buddhism and Hinduism is whether the universe, as we know it, is a delusion or not. But in both schools of thought, this material world is definitely a distraction. In Judaism, the interesting thing is that even though materialism as an end in itself is a distraction, spirituality is not the end of the journey. The end of the journey is a place that's neither spiritual nor material. That's why you can return to the material world. And you can integrate both of them. And that's why in Jewish mysticism, the act is more powerful than the meditation. So though meditation is a powerful technique, but ultimately you reach the divine essence through the action of a human being. The ultimate goal is the fusion of matter and spirit. This is a uniquely Jewish mystical approach. In Eastern mysticism, Far Eastern mysticism, this is not necessarily even aspired to, and definitely not acceptable, because for them the material is at best a stepping stone. At worst, it's a delusion, a distraction that doesn't allow a person to access the free-spiritedness of the light, so to speak. However, there are very profound parallels between the two. And this emerged a lot through our correspondence and through my own research a bit. And the parallels are so fascinating that actually words that parallel each other. So we all know Abraham is a Jewish guy, right? Now in Hinduism, there's a thing called Brahman. Brahman is the connection to that everything is connected to a divine source or to a source. Now Brahman is essentially the word for Abraham in that language. Now you think this is just some coincidence, it's not. If you open up a Bible, Chumash, you turn to the chapter called Acharei in the book of Genesis. So there's a story that after Sarah dies and Abraham buries her, then sends off his servant Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac, and he finds Rebekah. So the end of the chapter talks about what happened to Abraham the rest of his life. So it says that he married a woman called Keturah and had children with her. Some say Keturah is Hagar, or maybe everyone says that. Hagar was his original wife, or the wife that he took and had Yishmael with. And what did he do with these children? What happened with them? So the Torah says he sent them to the east, to the land of the east. So Journey to the East is not Hermann Hesse's original title. It's actually a biblical verse in Chayei that Abraham sent his children to the east. Eretz Kedem. It's to the east. And Rashi says, bringing from the Medrash and from different sources, that he sent them with mystical teachings. The Shemus of Avodah Zarah, however it's written there. He sent them with mystical names or mystical powers. So it's not inconceivable to say that many of the fundamental principles in Far Eastern thought have strong parallels to Jewish mysticism because they come from similar sources. You know, there's some point that everybody goes back to certain similar roots. Adam and Eve knew certain mysteries they shared with their children. Abraham knew certain secrets he shared with his children, not just with Isaac, also with his other children. So it's a very logical and very makes much sense that as the transmigration of populations moved around, many of them had their roots in similar ancestors. That's why it's not surprising that Abraham and Brahman and many other terms. Here, someone just gave me this book here to look at from Glazerson, The Grandeur of Judaism in the East. But I've seen other books that do the same. They show these parallels. The biggest parallel of, or maybe not, I can't say the biggest, but one of the fundamental parallels of Eastern thought and Judaism is obviously, what I was referring to earlier, is a inner energy that is the driving force of all of existence. In Western thought, this is a recent phenomenon. Even though Greek philosophers and other philosophy in the West always understood and related to forces that were beyond the visible, but much of Western philosophy is very structured, and as I said earlier, very mathematical. Scientific, you would call. Essentially, if you'd see the difference between West and East, often it's described in the digital world, we describe the difference between digital and analog. Or some would call the difference between circles and squares. A square has a structure. It has corners, edges. A circle has no beginning and no end. Yin and yang, if you wish. There are many terms that describe the difference between West and Eastern thinking. Eastern thought is much more conceptual and abstract. Western is much more structured. And they both have virtues, mind you. They both have their strengths. One defines much more in logical and structured terms. The other one is much more driven by, as I said earlier, the paradox. Not the illogical, but logic is not taken that seriously. And you could say in personalities, some of us are Eastern souls and some are Western. You know, you ever hear someone called a square? You know any squares in your life? I think it goes into that category. If I ask for a volunteer, any squares in this room here, please raise your hand. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Do you know anyone? Is everyone square or only?
The best matchmaker if you want to connect yourself to the gods through the squares.
Yeah?
Yes.
You're looking for a match? Okay, good luck.
How would you find my
So you should walk around with a sign, I'm a square, and maybe they'll be attracted to you. Yeah. So how do you define a square? A yeka is a square? What? I don't know. But I don't think we mean the same definition. Square is not just a mathematical term. It has other implications. You ask some of the women in the room, they'll share with you. Okay. There's certain criteria. It's very easy to find out who's a square. Most squares will not acknowledge the square, or they don't think it's a problem, so they don't call themselves as such. But I'm not here to be critical of anybody. I think in a healthy human being, you need to have a certain square side and a certain circle side. You may be fascinated to know this, and I was fascinated when I first discovered, so maybe I'm just projecting. In Kabbalistic thought, so there's a talk about the mystical tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is usually defined as a circular black hole. Circular. Circle, in general, mathematically and also spiritually, is, of course, as I said earlier, equanimous, it's equal. Everything is equidistant from the center. A circle also has a certain symbolism for infinity, because there's no beginning and no end. Where does the circle begin? Where does it end?
going back to your age?
A circle is symbolic also of a song. A song essentially is a circular thing. You can continue singing a song forever and ever. It's just that most people don't have an attention span for that. But the fact is the song doesn't really have an end, because where it ends is also where it can begin again. And sentences are not that way. So there are things in this world we call linear. There are things that we call circular. Or, as I said, analog and digital. In general, the world has evolved from a more linear way of understanding the structure of existence to a much more circular way of understanding it. Today, things are much more amorphous, much more not as tangible. The invisible is much more dominant in our lives. DNA, microscopic particles, subatomic, and so on and so forth. Invisible forces that are not measured in quantity, they're measured in quality, but they carry potency. It's really almost counterintuitive. I think I mentioned last class, usually you would associate power with size. The larger it is, the more dominant it will be. Today it's the exact opposite. As I mentioned before with silence and sound, the more energy, the less container. Today you see this. The most potent forces in life are the most invisible ones. They're the smallest. The more potent they are, the less volume they have. How do you explain that? That can only be understood in a circular way where the forces that drive existence are not defined in logical, structural terms. So yes, when you talk about two armies in the Middle Ages, usually the army that would win is the larger army, the one with more soldiers, the more weapons. And yes, you need ingenuity, you could have surprise, so you could have a smaller army win with more intelligence. But it's also more of intelligence. Today, it's not necessarily. The guy that has the right weapon, that can be a nuclear reaction, one person can destroy 1 million people. Obviously, if you have nuclear weapons with 1 million soldiers, it's better than nuclear weapons with 1 soldier. But so quantity is not completely meaningless. But the point is, quality takes on a whole new shape and form. And same thing in the biological structure of things. God forbid, one mutant cell can wreak so much havoc that nothing that much so-called, much more tangible diseases cannot accomplish. God forbid. So the point of all of this is that we live in a world where we can appreciate and understand the circular. But the fact is we also need the other side, which is one of the reasons, by the way, the sun and the moon are metaphorical in Jewish thought to the circular person and to the square. For instance, the sun is very consistent, like a structure. The moon is constantly changing. And in Jewish life, we need to have both lunar personalities and solar personalities. So there's something to be said for the square, which is a certain structure. And as I said earlier, the ultimate goal in Judaism is not to have the transcendent experience alone, but to return to tell about it. Which really brings me why I discussed this whole topic tonight in the first place. besides the relevance of it in general, is because of this week's Torah portion. Maybe I should have began with this, but the difference does it make? We're talking circular, so there's no beginning and no end. So this week's chapter, Acharei, it's actually two chapters, Acharei, Kedoshim. So Acharei begins like this. What does the word Acharei mean? After. After the death of the two children of Aaron. It's a continuation of a story that began 2 chapters back. What was the story there? That Aaron had 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, and the temple was erected and was built for the first time. The 2 sons of Aaron, in their great passion for a transcendent experience, ran into the holy temple unprepared. And as a result, it says, a strange fire, Eish Zara, came and consumed them, and they died. And later Moses explained and told this to Aaron, who was of course in grief, that he said that your 2 sons are the holiest of all. And when God said, those closest to me will sanctify my name, he was referring to your 2 sons. B'krevi HaKadosh. The Orach Chaim, other commentaries explain, especially in Hasidic philosophy, explains that they had what we call a rotzeh without a shuv. They had a profound yearning to reach beyond the monotony and structure of existence, but they did not find a way to return. So they died. They burned up. In other words, they went in unprepared. It's very similar and compared to the story of the 4 great sages that went in Arba Nichnasu Lepardis, the 4 that went into the orchard or the garden, if you wish. And there the same thing happened. It says, Ben Azai, Hitzis Rumez, died out of the intensity of what he experienced. Ben Sheshes went mad, insane, from what he saw. Acher, or he was called then Elisha ben Avuya, Acher, later to be known as Acher, the other one, became an apostate, lost his faith. And the 4th one, Rabbi Akiva, the only one, which says, Nichnas b'shalom v'yotze b'shalom. He entered in peace and exited in peace. These are Talmudic stories and biblical ones that are talking about spiritual experiences. So it's not an uncommon topic in Judaism. It's just perhaps not known by so many, and many don't relate to it. But you're talking about people who were searching to go into the beyond. They were looking to see God. When Moses asked to see God, God said, no man can see me and live. And Moses, in his own way, found ways to see God. Obviously, when we talk of seeing God, we don't mean in an anthropomorphic, childish terms. You're talking about experiencing reality. How many of us can experience reality, naked reality, without any shields, without any shrouds, and contain it? We can barely look at a sun without sunglasses and shades, let alone a deeper truth. So though we are perhaps seekers of truth, I say perhaps because that's a good question as well, but let's say we are, that doesn't mean that you're ready and you just can see it as it is in its pure form. It means that the journey and the process of growth is such that step by step you build your containers, you contain more and more, and you get closer and closer to the light. Always be humble, and being humble and being mindful that it's not something you can rush into. You rush too quickly, you can get very deeply burned. More importantly, you may not be able to come back and build a life, normal life. Many people, I've met many of people like this, who did see certain things, whether it was induced by natural means or not, it's another discussion, but they could not ground themselves to build a home and a family. They could not come back and live what we call structured lives. So you can make the argument, who cares? At least they see the light. But that's not the purpose in Judaism. Because ultimately, what Judaism teaches, and this is a fascinating concept, as profound and as close, Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, were to God, this is not seen as an admirable story. We don't say they sinned, because their intention was pure. They were not looking, but ultimately what their sin was, if you call it such, was spiritual indulgence. So many people indulge in selfishness, in narcissistic material temptations. We're not discussing that. But indulgence could also happen on a very sublime level. It's all about me. They were thinking more about their pleasure of experiencing the divine and experiencing the transcendent than the humility necessary to walk carefully when you walk on holy ground. There's a fascinating story of Moses. I think I've written, yes, I did write about it a while back, where Moses, the first time he sees the burning bush, and God says, look, and he says, I don't want to look. That's a sign of a truly divine person. Because you think divinity, if you're a spiritual person, and someone's offering you spirituality, you should run. But Moses was wiser than that. He says, you have to earn your way. Humility is the door, the key that opens up the door of the highest experiences, not passion. So no one's taking away the power of passion. We should all be blessed with it. But you have to also know every fire can go two ways. An uncontained fire can burn. And sometimes it burns the person who's burning, meaning the person who's hot and on fire. So it has to be done all with great care. And in Jewish mysticism, and this is ultimately what I find absolutely remarkable, that paradox, which in a way I shared with Julianne in that story, the ultimate paradox is not the paradox that water and wet and dry are all one, and there's no such thing as two forces. That's one thing. The ultimate paradox is that you can live in a contained, finite world and experience absolute infinity. How is that possible? In the Far Eastern mysticism, they will always say, no, if you want infinity, you have to realize that the finite world is not fully real. In Judaism, that's not the case. So there's a classic statement made by Ibn Gabbai, one of the great Kabbalists, in this book called, Sefer called Avodas HaKodesh, Divine Service. And he says, he talks about the divine reality, ultimate reality. He says, divine reality is such, Ein Sof, meaning the ultimate infinity is such, that it's Shleimus Hakel. It contains everything. Listen to this. It contains everything, and therefore, just like it has the power to extend infinitely, it also has the power, the gvul, to extend finitely. Because if you were to say that the infinite can only be infinite and not be finite, that too makes it finite. In other words, ultimately something that is completely real and complete cannot even be defined by the word infinite, because that too is a limitation. It would be saying that divine experience can only be experienced in the infinite world, not in a finite universe like ours. That too is a limitation. So ultimately in Jewish mysticism, when you try to experience the ultimate reality, you can't say it's this, and you can't say it's not that, because that itself is a limitation. So you have to say it's this and not that, and this and that, and also not that, and neither of the two, and beyond that as well. And this is a true statement. This is a statement I just quoted from the Hasidic mystical texts. In Far Eastern mysticism, they'll talk about the nothingness, that which is beyond everything and encompasses everything. But there are no mitzvahs, and there are no structures that bring that beyond into the reality as we know it. So you have in religious disciplines, you have, for instance, in Calvinist Christianity, the concept of, they call it the work ethic, the Protestant work ethic. It's really the basis of capitalism. Max Weber and the other philosophers who developed that brand of Christianity, which gave birth to the idea that through being a virtuous person, working hard, building your family, that's the divine expression in this world. Which is really almost the antithesis to Far Eastern thought, where their ultimate divine experience is through not being involved in the material, being a monk, asceticism. Judaism, if you could put it in if you want to do it as a study in contrast, is neither of the two, and brings the best of both worlds by saying that you can take the ultimate divine that the Far Eastern thinkers say is only possible when you separate from this life, from this material world, and you can experience it in the most mundane aspects of your life. How is that possible? That's only possible if you open up to the concept that the divine is not closer to the world of the spirit than it is to the world of matter. It's not closer to the infinite than to the world of the finite. When I wrote this to Leonard Cohen, so first, my response to him, So first, he didn't respond, but then later, he said to me, if he had known that 25 years ago, he would have the same Rebbe that I have. That's what he told me. Because he never heard that before. He heard that you reach, which is itself an insight. When you live in a Western world and you see people consumed with self-interest, so the infinite is very seductive. It teaches you, as I said earlier, to go to a new world that is not experienced. But someone can experience both of them together? That doesn't even make sense. But it's really the ultimate paradox. Why should it not make sense for a person, as I wrote to him, someone that has no problem with paradoxes, why do you have a problem with this concept? So how is it possible? So I'll tell you two stories. These are Hasidic stories that demonstrate the possibility. One is that Chassid who was a great devout student of his Rebbe, and then he went off into business. I shared the story in the past. And the business he chose in Russia was, he became a galoshes manufacturer. You all know what galoshes are? Galoshen in Yiddish, okay. So galoshes. Now, he made a lot of money because you have to remember, in those days they did not have pavement yet. So in the unpaved streets of the shtetl, which got very muddy in the rain and the snow and the weather, having galoshes saved many shoes. So it was a very good investment in those days. So he made a lot of money, he became very involved in his galoshes business, to the point he really had no time for anything else, not study, not prayer, definitely not transcendence. He came back to his Rebbe, and his Rebbe gave one look at him, saw where his head was. So he said to him the classic words. He said to him in Yiddish, and then I'll translate. He said, "Ich hab gesehen Fiesen Galoschen, aber ich hab keinlich gesehen Koppen Galoschen." I've seen feet in galoshes, but I've never seen a head in galoshes. Which meant that his whole mind and his whole being, his head, was literally like, think of the image. And not just your feet, but your whole being is like stuck in the galoshes. And the second story is of another chassid, the earlier generation, who happened to also be a successful business person. And listen to this paradox. At the end of the year, when you make your accounting, din v'cheshbon, accountability, so he would sit down, he would write down like this. Tishrei, or let's say January, losses and investment and gains, profit and loss, February profit and loss, March, and each one he would calculate the numbers of the income, of the investment, and the net profit or loss. And he went through every month, and he came to the bottom, in Elul, or in the English equivalent would be December, wherever the fiscal year ends, he would write Sachakol, which means the total, is whatever you think would be the total of all the months. He would write 3 words, Ein Eid Milvadeh, that there's nothing but God. This was on his statements. Now you'd think you don't want to trust a person like that with investments, right? So you have a lot of choices today who to trust. I think he's the guy you want to trust. I'll tell you why. Because the question is asked, what is this? If he's so consumed with God, on every line he should have written January, God, February, God. What kind of numbers altogether? He shouldn't have any number on any line. It's all about God. This guy's a godly man, doesn't care about the numbers. The answer is, if he would write God on every line, he shouldn't be in business. He should be in a religious academy, teaching or studying or praying. You're a businessman. There's a concept in Judaism called Masa Matan Ba'amuna, to run your business ethically, faithfully. And you have responsibilities. You can't just say, I was meditating and I forgot my business. Then don't be in business. Don't have others rely on you. But when it comes to the sum total, the total of the totals, what's the bottom line after everything is said and done? Money is a means, it's not an end. His end is very clear. It's for a higher purpose. That there's nothing that really exists but God. That's the paradox. How do you dance in both worlds? That he can be so focused on the number and be businesslike, and at the same time never forget his sights on the destination. So this is a paradox, absolutely. It's the hardest thing of all. It's much easier to isolate yourself, insulate yourself in a yeshiva or in the wilderness, as the scouts wanted to do, or in some other spiritual oasis and meditate and transcend, or the other extreme, to immerse in the material world and just stay there and try to be a little ethical. But how can you have both? To be completely immersed and your head doesn't get into the galoshes. That's a big challenge. Today's economic world, we see what it is. You know, and people's response, many of them, is, once you get into the business world, be ready to be a criminal one way or another. Yeah, maybe not criminal, maybe you're cutting corners, maybe you don't get caught, whatever the words are. But be ready, you're in an unethical world. And some say, okay, this is the consequences, I don't want to go back there. I'd rather go off to some spiritual, the desert. That's the temptation. Judaism always says, no, this is the place you were sent to. And ultimately, the victory and the challenge is, can you enter a world that is driven by self-interest and greed and many other self stuff and still remain a transcendent human being? It sounds like opposites, but it's actually the dream of the Jewish dream. And there's no mysticism in the world that ultimately aspires to such a concept. They do not see it as possible. Now you may ask, well, if this is possible, how come we don't find anybody like this? Okay, so that's why I'm here, to look, maybe one of you are the candidate. We're going to nominate someone here to represent us all. Anybody willing to be the scapegoat? I wouldn't call it scapegoat. Well, Joseph in the Bible is a model for this. You know, the other forefathers, ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob chose to be shepherds. Why? Why shepherds? Because a shepherd is insulated from the challenges of Wall Street, or whatever the Wall Street of those times were. The commodity of the time was sheep, but nevertheless, when you're a shepherd, you live, they graze, the sheep are very docile creatures, they graze in the fields, the meadows, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were free to meditate, pray in nature. Who's the first so-called biblical figure thrown into the business world? Joseph. He's the first Jewish accountant in the house of Potiphar, as the Targum says there, married the Chushbon. And then he becomes the viceroy of Egypt, turning that country into a superpower. You can imagine he was quite consumed with the trade of grain in the time of the famine, and as the Torah describes. What was the ultimate purpose? What was the ultimate achievement? And they asked the question, who's greater, Joseph or the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? They say Joseph was greater because the other three chose a life where they weren't challenged like that. He was in the harsh Egypt with all the competition and maintained his integrity, that 22 years later, when Jacob heard that Joseph remembered what they had studied 22 years earlier, he knew that he was not compromised by his descent. That's much greater, because how do you maintain such spiritual integrity and composure amidst the wolves? That's much, much harder, almost impossible. To the extent when Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, you'd think he had all the right to be angry. What does he say to them? The memorable words that the commentaries, the Zohar says, serve us till this day. The schus of Joseph overlooked his own pain. He says to them, why are you embarrassed? They were embarrassed because they had sold him into slavery. They almost killed him. And suddenly they meet him. Imagine the shame of brothers discovering the brother that they so destroyed. Joseph says to them, do not be disturbed. You did not do this to me. It is God that sent me here to save you and our father, and to save your people. Because through him they had the grain, they were able to rebuild their lives. This is a man, this is what he said. And the Zohar says, the way he overlooked his personal anguish, which he was completely legitimate, would have been completely legitimate, was something that would serve his children and grandchildren until the end of time. Now, these are the models that we Jews and the Torah sees as the ultimate model. This is the model of the combination of the highest transcendental experience in the material world that's possible. Practically speaking, for instance, in our lives, there's a Seder Hayom, there's a sefer called Seder Hayom that says, the Talmud says that a person should be more careful in Tfilas Mincha, in the afternoon prayer, than all the other prayers, because Ein Elyonena El Tfilas Mincha. There's no response like the response that comes at the afternoon prayer. So the question is asked, why? The morning prayer is a much more fundamental one, seemingly. The longer prayer. You say Shema. The evening prayer, you also say Shema. Mincha is the shortest prayer, and in a sense, you could say almost like a secondary prayer, if you can call it that. But it definitely doesn't seem to have the same weight as the other two. And the Seder Hayom says the following: because to pray in the morning or in the evening, you're not yet in the work day. So before the day begins, it's easier in the end of the day. Mincha means that in the middle of your work, while you're immersed in your own investments and in your own plans, you're able to tear yourself away and remember that there's a higher authority and pray to God. That is the ultimate accomplishment. Similar, as I said to Joseph, that in that world, you're able to feel that you're higher, something higher. That's our challenge. Now, on a practical level, can all of us reach that? Maybe somebody. We have to know what the standard is. Before you reach anything, you have to know what is the ultimate standard. So in this week, when we read about the sons of Aaron and their so-called mistake in the name of transcendence and the name of passion, we say, Acharei, here's what happens after their death. God says, Bezois, now I will teach you how to enter the Holy of Holies and come back intact. And the Torah continues the laws of Yom Kippur, actually. Yom Kippur is a time when we enter the Holy of Holies, but we learn how to then bring it into the rest of the days of our year. So in Yom Kippur, there's a certain sanctity, the most sacred day of the year. You fast, dress in white, you pray most of the day. You realize you have to do this with humility. You don't just jump in. But the ultimate secret of Yom Kippur is how you bring that transcendence back when we return to so-called mundane life, daily life. So, in a simple way, simple suggestions for each of us. If you know that this is the standard, it means that in your small little acts, and maybe the greatest of all is when you are involved in your work, not when you're praying or you're going to a Shabbos dinner or Shabbat dinner or to some party or some inspirational moment. It's tomorrow when you will return to your so-called most mundane part of your life is when you have the most powerful and potent opportunities. That's when a person can behave in a refined way there and say a kind word to someone, especially in our volatile times. That's when what the mystics would call you experience an atzmus moment, a moment of reality. That's ultimate reality. Not to minimize. Obviously, during prayer, during sacred moments, you experience something like that, it's great. But the ultimate challenge and the ultimate achievement is when you can go into a world which is completely antithetical to a so-called higher presence and bring a higher presence there. That is the ultimate purpose of life. And that only a soul on this earth can accomplish, not souls in heaven. And only souls on this earth that are not sitting in yeshiva or in spiritual environments all the time is those that are in the workplace. And we all know how difficult it is because you're dealing with money and you're dealing with corruption and you're dealing with many forces of pressure. Who has not compromised and sold their soul somewhat in the marketplace? Very rare to find that. But if you know that that's the battle, and you know that's more important, that's the purpose of why your soul came down to earth, in a way it has a certain excitement. It means, can you really achieve that? So think of it that way. Think of it that as our challenge. To do exactly which no one really does. To do exactly which is so difficult to do. That's what makes this world and this earth and life on this earth meaningful. In a strange way, it's the challenges that make it meaningful, exactly. And it's the places that have the greatest challenges is where you have the most power to create change. So from this perspective, a time like ours, when the economy is going through its own meltdown, so yes, on one hand, the challenge for many of us is, can we hold on to a job, make ends meet, what's going to be with money, fear, uncertainty, where are we going next? That's a very legitimate one, but there's a greater challenge. Will this climate and environment cause us to become victims? Or do we see it perhaps as a wake-up call, an opportunity to bring a higher force into the picture? Something greater, something that is not so obvious. That requires strength. That requires the ability to transcend even the volatility and the uncertainty that so affects everybody's psychology. It may also require not watching so many television shows and discussions and talk shows about these matters, which, as you'll discover, doesn't really solve anything. It's it feeds our diet of television and voyeurism. But you'll probably hear the same discussions in a month from now, a month from past, and it's great, what do they call, water cooler discussions. But if you really want to become something other, it's like, are you part of the problem or part of the solution? Coming from a family of journalists, we put it this way: there are people who make things happen, there are people who watch things happen, and there are people who ask what happened. So that's a choice we all have. And ultimately, obviously, option one is the ultimate. You can make things happen, but only when you don't allow yourself to be a victim of the system. And to change the system always requires stepping outside of it. That's ultimately the Jewish mystical challenge. Nadav and Avihu stepped out, but they could not come back. The rest of us are down here and don't really step much out. The challenge is, can you step out and at the same time be in? That's what we're here for. And I feel, in a way, exhilarated by the challenge. And please join me. Everyone have a very good evening. I want to just say that the class is dedicated, sponsored by Mark Belinsky in honor of his grandfather's Yotzai Ben Sion Ben Yitzchak on the 4th of Iyar. I also want to mention our dear friend, 16 years ago, Daniel Namdar, who tragically was torn away from us through a car accident in Italy. I've been a supporter of the Meaningful Life Center from the outset. Is the sponsor actually, and his family sponsors in his name of the Week in Review that we always offer here. So I want to mention his yahrzeit as well, and the name of his family, his daughters should all find the right shidduchim, and in his merit may all of us, and the merit of Mark's grandfather as well, may we all find our soulmates, hold on to them, and above all, unite the finite and the infinite. Everyone have a very pleasant evening. Tomorrow night, Philip will give his class, and I shall be back here Wednesday night for the next episode. Good night, everybody.